Welcome back, everybody, to this week's episode of Heavy Branches. I'm Jacob.
And I am Tanner.
And we are getting ready to hop into Acts chapter 17 this week. But before we get there, Tanner, how's your week been?
My week's been good for the most part. We announced, well, I preached twice Sunday, which was cool. And we also announced that my wife, Mackenzie, and I are expecting a child, our first. And so that's coming down the line. February 22nd is the due date, which I actually think I said that on last week's podcast also.
I think you did.
But anyway, yeah, I'll say it again. That's fine. It's exciting. And I've been kind of getting a kickoff. I'm starting a series this week, or this coming Sunday, at church, and see what else is going on. That's pretty much. School started this week. I'm taking Hebrew with Jason Cole.
Hebrew the language, not Hebrews the book.
Yep, Hebrew the language. And then I'm taking Revelation the book with Matt Sullivan. And so yeah, that's exciting.
So
too.
are you going to be able to read/write Hebrew by the end of this semester, do you think? Or
Jason said that I would be able to read some Hebrew words. I've got this list of vocab words basically.
Yeah.
Translate a little bit, which would imply, I think, being able to write some.
So you're going to be like our Hebrew scholar here in just a few months for.
Definitely not.
If we go to it like an Old Testament book after Acts.
Definitely not. Although I am excited to see how this helps me study the Old Testament.
Yeah, you'll have to be you and Meg will be my go-to Hebrew people then.
Well, Meg's four-year degree Hebrew student, so
No, she's a history major with a minor in biblical languages.
Yeah, and with 4 years of Hebrew under her belt.
No, she's not taking Hebrew for 4 years.
Yes, she has.
Really?
Yeah, I'm pretty sure she took Hebrew for 4 years.
I thought it was 5 or 6 semesters maybe, but we'll have to ask her. Meg, if you have no idea.
Well, I mean, it's at least 4 classes is what I mean.
If you're listening to this and you have no idea who Meg is, that's Jacob Cabe's wife.
Yeah.
And she has taken a lot of Hebrew.
But anyway, I will add this to my week. I had a minor argument with Meg.
With Meg? When did you talk to Meg this week?
So I took my Hebrew class on Monday, and I was trying to do some of the homework on Tuesday, and I could not remember how to pronounce one of the letters because I was trying to practice. So I called Jacob Cabe. And and I called Jacob Cave to talk to Meg about what this Hebrew word was, and I don't even remember what it was at this point. But anyway, we had talked a week before that while we were at Louisville for that day where we were all there
to meet the staff and stuff.
The staff and stuff. I was talking to Jason Cole and Jacob Cave and Meg about how to pronounce Haggai because I preached Haggai Sunday night. And Jason said that he would just pronounce it Haggai, and then Meg was like, I'm going to look it up now when we get home. So I just learned Monday about what's called a dogesh lene, which is a little dot in the letter that I may not even be getting this right.
You're one class into Hebrew 1, so I'll cut you some slack.
But anyway, one of the dots means that the letter is doubled, and then one of the dots means that it's got a slightly different pronunciation. So this letter, I believe, means that the letter is doubled, in the way you pronounce it in Hebrew, which is why when we spell Haggai, when we transliterate it, it's got 2 G's in it.
Okay.
She made the argument that that's why it would be called Haggai, but Haggai is doubling the vowel I, not just the G. And so I argued with her that would be inconsistent because you're doubling the vowel. and putting an extra I in there.
Okay. I have no opinion on this. I have no idea.
I honestly just argued with her because I thought it would be funny. I have no idea what I'm talking about.
You do like to argue for
fun. So yeah, I think Dagesh Lane is the other one that changes the way it's pronounced, not the double letter one. So I don't even remember what that's called. But anyway, how was your week?
Well, I didn't have any arguments about the Hebrew language with anyone, but it was a good week. School started back, as you said. I had my first class today, actually. We're recording this on a Thursday night. And so I had my class today with Brian Schultz, Why Youth Leave the Faith.
Yeah.
And so super excited for that class. If you follow me on, I guess it's not following. Let me get my terminology right. If we're Facebook friends, you probably have seen me share posts from a guy named Red Pen Logic. I don't think I've shared one in a while, actually, but I've shared a lot of them in the past. And anyways, that guy, I think his name is Tim Barnett, but the guy that does Red Pen Logic, and then Elisa Childers, I think is the woman's name, wrote a book about deconstruction. And it's not just about youth deconstruction, but it's about like why people leave the faith. And that's one of our textbooks for the class, so I'm super excited to read that and probably going to end up doing my book report on it. But I feel like that's going to be a really practical class just because that's a problem a lot of churches have today is they have youth grow up in the church, but then a lot of times they go off to college or go into the workforce full-time and have that big life change, and then they end up leaving the church and leaving the faith. So hopefully going to try to learn why that happens and what we as the church can do to hopefully stop some of that from happening with our youth.
Yeah, and knowing Brian and his passion for like worldview stuff, I'm sure he'll do really well with that class. So.
Oh yeah, I'm really excited for it. So that's kind of been the highlight of my week is getting back into school. I enjoyed the little break of not having homework, not having tests, not having stuff to grind and do. But I'm glad to be back. So excited for that.
Yeah. You're also preaching this Sunday, right?
I am, yeah.
Do you know what you're going to preach yet?
Probably a sermon on the resurrection from 1 Corinthians 15.
That'll be good. I think I've heard that one.
You have? Well, I don't know. I think you have.
I probably have.
Anyways, I'm preaching down at Morton's Gap Christian Church, which is Jacob Cabe's home congregation. They're regular preachers on vacation, and they figured I wasn't preaching anywhere that Sunday, so I'm going to go preach at his home church. So that'll be kind of cool.
Yeah, that'll be cool.
I'll stay with his parents that night because they're 4 hours from here, so that's way too long to go on a Sunday morning. But yeah, looking forward to that. I've been preaching a lot last month or so, and got quite a bit more on the schedule coming up in the fall. So
you don't want to leave at 3 a.m. to get there at 7 a.m.?
No. I would be a zombie up there preaching. It would be terrible.
Yes, you would be. So would I. All right, we're in Acts chapter 17 this week.
Do you want to
go ahead.
Sorry. Do you want to establish Song of the Week as a beginning of the episode thing or end? Because we started it last week and we did it at the end, but then you were like, we may do it at the beginning.
I think I like the end.
You like it at the end?
I think I like the end.
Give them something to stick around for?
Yeah.
All right, we'll do it at the end.
All right. Let's hop in here to Acts chapter 17 this week. I just noticed this as we were kind of talking about the episode today, but next week is episode 50. That is pretty wild that we've
52 weeks in a year, right?
Yeah, we're
almost at a year.
Technically, this week is a year for us.
Yeah, because we missed 1 week. I think we missed 2 weeks in a row because you were really sick 1 week, and then I think you gave it to me, and I was sick the next week.
Yeah. So this is actually a year, but in 2 weeks it'll be a full year's worth of actual recorded episodes. So that's pretty cool. But yeah, let's hop in here to. Sorry, next week would be the year, and I messed up.
We're right at a year.
We're close. Anyway,
Acts 17. Get us going.
Acts 17. This passage is very special passage, I think.
Like the whole chapter?
The whole chapter. And the reason for me saying this, and I'm going to give a shout out to Brian Schultz, because not only is he teaching Jacob's class this year, he's taught several classes for both of us, and he actually held a class at Hillsboro, or person to person, in the spring of this past year. And the focus was on evangelism in the 21st century. And that's where that's where I heard this from Brian. But basically, the way he described this chapter was that this chapter gives us a philosophy for evangelism today. A lot of us ask the question, how do we share the gospel? Well, this gives us a bit of foundation for things that we should be considering when we approach people to share the gospel with them, which should be everybody that we come in contact with. We've talked about that before. But as we go down through this passage, we're going to talk about some key things that Paul shows us that he did in order to gain footing with the people so that he could share the gospel with them. And we'll talk a little bit probably about the phrase meet them where they're at and what that means and what that doesn't mean, because that goes along with this. But it's really going to show us how to begin with how a person currently believes, or what they currently believe about God, and then to go from that point. And then it shows us that we must recognize what worldview a person has, or what worldview a person holds to, and then evangelize from that. And this philosophy doesn't just work in the circumstances that we see in chapter 17. This philosophy is applicable for everybody from an atheist that doesn't have any belief in God, all the way to a person that believes in the God of the Bible but doesn't quite have everything right yet. It's just establishing where they're at and then going from there. So as we start here, we get into where Paul is, and Silas and also Timothy is with them, and they're in Thessalonica. And just in the first couple verses, I'll just read verses 1 and 2, and we'll call this our verse 1 for the week. Now, when they had traveled through Amphipolis and Apollonia, they came to Thessalonica, where there was a synagogue of the Jews. And according to Paul's custom, he went to them, and for 3 Sabbaths reasoned with them from the Scriptures. So this was Paul's normal routine. When he would go into a new place, he would find the synagogue, and that's where he would spend time, especially at the beginning. And oftentimes word would spread from the synagogue very quickly out to the Gentiles, and there would be many Gentiles too. And we see that would come to Christ, and we see that in verse 4, a large number of God-fearing Greeks and a number of it says, and some of them were persuaded to join Paul and Silas, and some of the Greeks were included in that. But what we see here is that he begins in the synagogue, he's there for 3 Sabbaths, he meets them where they're at. So let's go ahead and talk about that phrase, since we're already there. Meeting a person where they're at does not mean that we meet them in their sin, which I think a lot of times people use that as an excuse to go and do sinful things with people.
Like we shouldn't go out and get drunk with our alcoholic friends in order to try to reach them. Is that what you're saying?
Yeah. And I know for a fact that has been used as an excuse to excuse me, I had to sneeze. I'm sure you heard that too. But anyway, they use that as an excuse to, and maybe their intention is actually good, but it's misguided. We need to remember that meeting a person where they're at is not meeting them in their sin and doing their sin, but it is going to them where where they need us and helping them out of that, not getting involved in it.
Yeah, I think a great lesson we can learn from that statement, meeting people where they're at. If we want to get the gospel to people who are living sinful lifestyles, which by the way is everyone who's not a Christian,
Mm-hmm.
is there are going to be some people that you can invite to church and they'll come. There are going to be other people that you can invite them to church as many times as you want, but they just will not, for whatever reason, come to church. And so sometimes we have to be able to be prepared to take the gospel to them, I mean, physically, literally, where they're at, instead of taking the method of inviting someone to church so that they can hear the gospel.
And what this really comes down to is the fact that Paul is approaching these people based off of where he knows their understanding of God is. And really, a person's understanding of God will dictate what their worldview is. How they view the world is what I mean by that. These Jewish people, and as verse 4 says, these God-fearing Greeks, they would have been people that at some high level understood who the God of the Bible was. And so that is where Paul had to start. And so meeting them where they're at is not just about like location. It's really more about understanding where a person is in their understanding of who God is. They may understand who God is very well, or like an atheist, they may have no belief in God at all. And we have to understand that that's where we have to begin. And we're going to talk about this more, but and I think we've said this on the podcast before, if we don't first recognize God as creator, we will not understand why we need him to save us.
So just to kind of go right along with that, when we talk about evangelism, and what we mean by that is sharing the gospel with people and trying to help people become Christians. I mean, the gospel is that Jesus died for their sins, was buried, rose again 3 days later, and then is coming back again to judge the living and the dead. That's the gospel, very simply. But sometimes sharing the gospel with someone, we have to go back long before Jesus when we start.
Mm-hmm.
I think that's what you're getting at here, because if the person we're talking to doesn't believe in God, doesn't believe in a creator of the universe, doesn't believe in anything spiritual, starting with Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection isn't going to matter to them if they don't already believe in God. Is that kind of what you're getting at there?
Yeah, and there's multiple things to go off of that with, but if they don't believe in God, they don't believe that they're accountable to anything.
Right.
And if they don't believe they're accountable to anything, they don't believe that they're living in sin. They also don't believe that there's a God to love them and that would be willing to sacrifice for them. Why? And the idea of sacrifice to the world, especially a sacrifice of like what we see in the scriptures with Jesus, especially a sacrifice like that doesn't make sense to the world. The Bible even talks about how that is foolishness to man, to the world. And so all of these things, unless they first get a grasp of who God is, the true God, the creator God, the God of the Bible, they're not going to grasp the gospel and why it matters.
Absolutely.
And so that's but here, as Paul is in Thessalonica, these people know who the God of the Bible is. And so that's where Paul could start. And so he begins to reason with them from the scriptures. That's how he approaches it. That's what they knew. They would have known the scriptures, and he begins to explain to them the gospel from the Old Testament. Now, I do have a question for you about that. Him reasoning from the scriptures.
Okay.
A lot of people think that faith is just a feeling, and that when we're sharing the gospel, we're just trying to convince people that the feeling is real. That is what faith is. But if that's all faith is, there's no reason to it. So why is Paul reasoning with the Jews?
Why is Paul reasoning with the Jews? Well, I feel like part of your question at the beginning was kind of geared towards, is faith just emotions and fuzzy feelings, or is it something based in reality? So I'll address that in a second. But as far as why Paul was doing that with the Jews, it goes back to what you're saying about meeting people where they were at.
Mm-hmm.
So Jewish people, I mean, he's reasoning with them in the synagogue. That's what the end of verse 1 tells us. And to the Jews, I mean, you got to remember, their religion is the Old Testament.
Yeah.
When he's preaching the Jews here, these are people who highly, highly value the Old Testament, just like Christians like us would value the Bible today. They would view the Old Testament as authoritative. They would view it as from God. And so when Paul is reasoning with them, it gives us the reasoning he was using. It says he was reasoning from the Scriptures, which at the point in time when Acts was written, the Scriptures means the Old Testament. So he's reasoning with them from the Old Testament, because the New Testament wasn't written yet, and it said he was explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had to suffer and rise again from the dead, and then saying Jesus is the Christ.
Mm-hmm.
So to the Jewish person, they were looking for the Messiah based off of all of the prophecies in the Old Testament. And a lot of the Jews didn't have the right idea of what the Messiah was going to be, which is why, by and large, the Jewish people rejected Jesus. But what Paul was trying to do here, by reasoning with them from the Old Testament, is taking what they held as near and dear and important and authoritative to them, which was the Old Testament, and using the prophecies and whatnot about Jesus, that he had to suffer and rise again, to give that reason that he was the Christ, the Messiah. So that's why I think he did that specifically with the Jews. Like, if he did that with Gentile people, they wouldn't care about the Old Testament. He would have to start farther back with Gentile people than the Old Testament, and we're going to see that as we get toward the end of this chapter. But Paul understood who his audience was, and he understood, because of who his audience was, where he needed to start in his evangelism to them. And I think that's a really important lesson for us to learn. As far as the other part of your question goes about how faith connects with reasons and evidence, is that kind of what you're hitting at there?
Yeah.
So I believe it was Johnny Presley who originally said this quote. I've heard multiple people say they heard it from him. Whether he got it from someone else or not, I'm not sure. But the quote is, "Faith always begins with reasons to believe." And I find that to be absolutely true. I think a lot of people have the idea of faith, that faith is just a decision we make to believe in something that there's no evidence for. And if you actually look at some dictionary definitions of faith, some of them will be really close to that. I remember we talked about that back in the apologetics series on the Evidence for God episode. We talked about that more in detail. But a lot of people have the idea of faith doesn't have anything to do with reality. It doesn't have anything to do with evidence or rationality or reasoning. It's all just a blind leap of trust. There's nothing really to base this on, but I just got to have faith. I just got to believe, even though I can't see. And that's totally misguided, and it's totally unbiblical to view faith that way. Faith always begins with reasons to believe, and Paul understood that, and that's why with the Jews he's giving them reasons to believe.
Yeah.
And when we get to Paul sharing the gospel with the Greeks here later in the same chapter, we're going to see again he gives them reasons to believe. It's not going to be the same reasons as the Jews, because again, the Old Testament didn't mean anything to the Greeks.
Yeah.
And so Tanner, what we've got to do today in our evangelism efforts towards people, we've got to realize what worldview do they have? Is it more like a Jewish worldview where they believe in a creator God and they believe in the Bible, in the Old Testament at least, like the Jews did? Or is it more toward a Greek person where maybe they believe in a God, maybe they don't, maybe they believe in a bunch of gods? A big task that we face today when we share the gospel with people is we've got to figure out what they believe about God and what their worldview is. That way we know where to start with them in our efforts to help them become a Christian.
Yeah. And what I really like about verse 3, just to kind of come off of what you're saying or add to it, is at the beginning of verse 3, it's talking about how Paul reasoned with them at the end of verse 2, but then it says explaining and giving evidence that the Christ had suffered. And so this reasoning that Paul's doing is based on hard evidence.
Yeah.
And
the cold hard truth, the facts.
And so, and you alluded to this already, but there are firm evidences. Paul was pulling some of them from the scriptures and showing how Jesus fulfilled those. Paul's gonna talk about to the Greeks about the evidences of creation and the fact that there is a God, one God, and that God sent Jesus, and he died, and he was buried, and he rose on the third day. That is the evidence, and that we'll get to that at the end of the chapter again. But
and let me just give a shameless plug here. I mean, I don't mind to do this, but if some of this idea is kind of new to you, like you're listening to this and you're thinking about faith and how it connects with evidence or reasons, you've never really looked at it that way before, or maybe you want to share the gospel with people, but you don't feel like you could give this kind of reasoning that Paul is talking about, that is a common situation for Christians to be in. So one, you're not alone. Secondly, that is a really big reason why Tanner and I did the apologetic series we did back a few months back. We have 3 episodes on here. One of them is all about the evidence we have for the existence of God.
Mm-hmm.
The second one was not all the evidence, but a lot of the evidence we have for the resurrection of Jesus. And the third one was all about the evidence we have for the Bible and why we know it's trustworthy and the evidence that it really is God's word. And so if some of this stuff is new to you and you're just you want more information on that, there's lots of places you can go, but that's one of the big reasons we did that little episode series.
Yeah, episode 27, 28, 29.
Okay.
So if you're the episode 28 is about the existence of God, episode 29 is about the resurrection of Jesus, and then episode
I think you said 27, 28, and 29.
27 is the existence of God, 28 is the resurrection, and 29 is
the Bible.
So those are actually mostly not us talking, but the guests we had on, because they would have done and did do a much better job than we would.
That's true.
But back here to Acts 17. So the aftermath of this is that some people come to believe, some people join Paul and Silas, but as usual, the Jews get upset, they get jealous because of the popularity being gained, and they drive them out of Thessalonica. And Paul and Silas and Timothy, they go to Berea, and while they're there, they pick it right back up. The same thing. They're in the synagogue. They are still reasoning with them through the scripture, as verse 11 says. It says, "Now these were more noble-minded than those in Thessalonica, for they received the word with great eagerness, examining the scriptures daily to see whether these things were so." So Paul's reasoning with them, and they're actually eager about this. They're like excited about this, and they're in the word themselves, actively looking to see, okay, is this true? And I really like the fact that the word noble is used here. The word noble, I think, gets thrown around for things that are not very noble these days. I mean, I don't remember. The Nobel Peace Prize was given to somebody a couple years ago that was just like wild to me. And I don't remember exactly what it was.
I'm not up to date on Nobel Peace
Well,
Peace
I'm not
Prize
up to
winners,
date on it
so
either. I just remember hearing about it, and like the reasoning was just like, why are we considering this noble? But I like what noble is defined by here. Noble is defined by their willingness to honestly examine the truth. And I'm going to say that one more time. Their nobleness was defined by their willingness to honestly examine the truth.
not only willingness, but they were eager too. It says they received the word with great eagerness. And every time I read that, I wonder to myself, are Christians today eager to receive the word?
And the outcome of such nobleness we see in verse 12. It says, therefore many of them believed, along with a number of prominent Greek women and men. The outcome of that willingness, eagerness to honestly examine the truth was they came to believe in Jesus Christ. When people lay aside their pride, when we lay aside our pride and honestly examine the facts, what is right, what is true, what is evidence, what the evidence is, we will come to believe, we will believe more, we will understand more. And I just, when I read that word noble and what it was connected to, I really, really liked that.
Yeah, that's good stuff, man.
So, similar thing in Berea, but the philosophy of evangelism is still there. He's still meeting these people where they are, presenting the scriptures to them, they're examining themselves, and the outcome is belief. Well, the people back in Thessalonica, they get upset and find out that Paul is in Berea now doing the same thing. So they come and there's, threats made, and Paul ends up in Athens, and soon Silas and Timothy are it says at the end of 15, they were to come to Paul as soon as possible, and so they left. But now Paul is in Athens, and at the beginning, he does go to the synagogue, as was his custom, as they said at the beginning of the chapter. And he's speaking with the Jews and some of the other God-fearing Gentiles that were a part of the synagogue. But he's also in the markets every day, and was teaching anybody that happened to be present. And he's getting philosophers. He's drawing people in that want to know more. And the only reason he's drawing people in, the only reason that he was able to do that is because he was willing to start speaking in the first place. I think that's the first key point here from this section, is that if we aren't proclaiming in the first place, then they won't know that they should hear or need to hear or want to hear. And so, if you're wondering why people aren't just running up to you asking why you believe what you believe, Peter says, always be ready to give a defense. Right? That's Peter.
Yeah.
Yeah.
1 Peter 3:15.
Yeah. If you aren't proclaiming, people aren't going to come asking.
You might disagree with me on this. I actually don't know. I don't know if we've talked about this before, but I actually wonder sometimes if we've done more damage than good with that old adage, share the gospel at all times, but when necessary, use words. Have you heard that before?
Yeah, I have.
I understand the intention behind that is people should see that something about your life as a Christian is different, and in a sense, that is sharing the gospel with them, because they might come up and ask you why you are so joyful during times of trouble, or so, fill in the blank on how Christians live different than the world. But the Bible also says that faith comes by hearing, and hearing by the word of Christ. And no person has ever been saved apart from hearing through words or reading through words the gospel.
Yeah, I absolutely agree with you.
And so I guess why I bring this up is, yes, it's good to let your Christian life be a light to the world and be a conversation starter for why you live different. But there also comes a time, if we want someone to be saved, that we have to open our mouth and use words to share the gospel.
Uh, we have tried to develop every possible excuse to not do our number one job as Christian people.
Yeah, and I think people sometimes are just misguided, and it's not like they're looking for a way out, but they almost feel justified in the sense of, well, using words to share the gospel isn't everyone's gift, and that's just not for me, so I'll just go live like a good Christian and kind of hope people ask me why I'm a Christian, and then I'll say, well, come talk to my preacher, kind of a thing. And yeah, I think that really hinders our ability to witness to people.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. Which is why I brought that up. If we aren't proclaiming, they won't know to hear. But because Paul's proclaiming, he's gathering people and he's giving himself the opportunity to truly share the gospel with people. And so this is where we get, Paul notices the foundation of the culture was around idol worship. We see that in verse 16. His spirit was being provoked within him as he was observing the city full of idols. He was seeing that. He understood that was part of the culture. He understood that this is where these people are. And he understands it so well that when we get into the sermon, he even makes mention of a specific idol that they've named to an unknown God, because they have all these idols for other things, but in case they forgot one, here's one more to an unknown God that maybe we forgot.
Yeah.
And so when we get to verse 22, Paul is starting with their worldview. He's addressing, here is where you all are at. And he does it in a very kind way. Notice that as well. Verse 22, so Paul stood in the midst of Areopagus and said, men of Athens, I observe that you are very religious in all respects. That's not confrontational at all.
Yeah, I think that the verse we quoted earlier, 1 Peter 3:15, the always be ready to give a defense for the hope that you have. A lot of times we just quote that, and that's just the middle of the verse. There's actually a part at the beginning and a part at the end before that. The part at the beginning is, and always set apart Christ as Lord in your heart.
Mm-hmm.
And the end of it is, but do this with gentleness and respect. And I think a lot of times we really beat the table with always be ready to give a defense for the hope that you have. But if we're going to obey the entirety of that verse and not just the middle part of it, it all starts with having a special part of our heart, a special part of our life and our priorities that sets apart Christ. And it also has to do at the end with, we've got to be prepared to give those reasons for our hope with gentleness and respect. Because if we just slam it on people and we're not gentle and we're disrespectful toward where they're at and their current situation and their current worldview, we're not going to be effective witnessers to people.
And I'll add to that with, I think we abuse that passage sometimes to make it seem like the only time we share is in defense.
Yeah, I could see that.
But there is a reason that the Word of God is described as the sword of the Spirit. That is the one thing that is described as an offensive tool.
There in Ephesians 6,
Yeah.
the armor of God passage. Yeah.
And yet, too often, we should be prepared to give in a defense whenever somebody comes asking, with kindness and gentleness. But that should not be the only thing that we're doing. We should be actively pursuing with the word of truth, with the Spirit, with the sword of the Spirit, people. just like Paul is here. If he wasn't doing that, they wouldn't have known that they needed to hear. It wouldn't have compelled them and convicted them to hear more from him. So he starts with their worldview, understanding that they are a people that are religious. And I love what Brian did with this. While these people aren't atheists, every person in the world is religious, whether they realize it or not. Yep. Even atheists, even though they would say that they are not religious, they hold to a religion. They have a belief and a faith system based on their worldview that there is no God. That is how they function. And so everybody has some sort of religion, whether they recognize it as such or not. But back to this passage, Paul he starts there with their worldview and uses their worldview to help move them from their current state to a Christian worldview by explaining who the one true God is. He used the unknown to proclaim the one true God. And I would encourage you to read this passage again and again and again. He does a beautiful job of talking about God as the creator. And I'm just gonna read verses 24 and following. The God who made the world and all things in it, since he is Lord of heaven and earth, does not dwell in temples made with hands. Okay, so he's establishing that there is one God who made the world and all the things in it, and as such he is Lord, he reigns over heaven and earth. And so he's not like all these other gods who you think are in idols or in temples. He doesn't dwell there in things made by human hands. Then verse 25, nor is he served by human hands, as though he needed anything, since he himself gives to all people life and breath and all things. So our God, the God of the Bible, doesn't need things from man. That phrase, as though he needed anything. He doesn't need to be served. He created us for us to serve him and for us to glorify him, but he doesn't need it. And since he himself gives to all people, he doesn't need it. And in fact, he is the reason that we have life in the first place. He's the one that gives, not the other way around. And then verse 26, and he made from one man every nation of mankind to live on all the face of the earth, having determined their appointment times and the boundaries of their habitation. He created mankind from one man. So he's gone not just back to who God is, but he's gone back to the creation of man. So you've got two key foundational doctrines to understanding our relationship to God and who God is. And so he goes all the way back to Adam here. And he doesn't necessarily take time to explain who Adam is, but he's making the point, this God created man, and everybody that lives came from that one man. And he created the boundaries of their habitat, where they would live. Verse 27, that they would seek God, if perhaps they might grope for him and find him, though he is not far from each one of us. He created us to seek him, to be with him. If we would long to, we would find him. If we would seek him, we would find him. Though many won't, God is not far from each one of us. Verse 28, for in him we live and move and exist, as even some of you poets have said, for we also are his children. Being then the children of God, we ought not to think that the divine nature is like gold or silver or stone. It's not like all of these idols. That's not what the divine nature is like. An image formed by the art and thought of man. It's not created by any man. Therefore, having overlooked the times of ignorance, God is now declaring to all men that all people everywhere should repent. So God is willing, through Jesus Christ, to overlook the ignorance. And in doing so, he's calling men to repent. Verse 31, because he has fixed a day in which he will judge the world in righteousness through a man whom he has appointed, having furnished proof to all men by raising him from the dead. There is a judgment coming. He will judge the world in righteousness, and it is through a man whom he appointed, and that man is Jesus, and he proved all of this on the foundation of the resurrection of Jesus. And when they heard about the resurrection of the dead, some of them began to sneer, but others said, we shall hear you again concerning this. And from there, from building that foundation of who God is, the one true God, and of how he created man in this universe, and how he went about bringing Jesus into the world, and that he brought him back from the dead, from that establishment, that opened the door for him to really then share the core of the gospel message and what it meant to these people. And the response, but some men joined him and believed. And then he names a few by name. So sometimes we've got to go back to the very beginning with people.
But notice, even when he had to go all the way back to creation with these Greeks, we still need to end up in the same place. The resurrection of Jesus. And when we're talking with people, it might not be like it is here with Paul. We might not get from establishing God as creator to establishing Jesus rose from the dead. That might not happen then all in the same conversation.
Mm-hmm.
But when we're talking with people and we're evangelizing to people, sometimes we got to start all the way back at creation. But by the end of our conversations, even if this is weeks or months over time, we do need to eventually get to the gospel and the resurrection of Christ.
Yeah. So this is a philosophy for evangelism today, this chapter. And so we must begin by kindly reshaping their worldviews, by helping them to understand God better so that they can understand themselves better in their need for God, their need for forgiveness, their responsibility, and their, what's the word I'm looking for?
Their responsibility to obey God? Is that what you're...
Yeah, there's another word that's just slipping my brain right now. But
their accountability?
Their accountability. Their accountability to God. And so when we help people through a worldview change, that's going to change everything else down the line. Worldview affects values, and values affects beliefs, or I'm missing one. Worldview affects, I don't remember the second one.
Worldview, values, beliefs, behaviors.
Yeah, no, I wasn't missing one. Yeah, worldview, values, beliefs, behaviors. And so it starts there. And that's really what the gospel is helping to adjust somebody's worldview to be rightly focused on God and Christ, and you go from there. Well, you have anything else on this chapter?
That's all, man. That's
all
it.
Right. Yeah, I think that's all I have too. That's Acts chapter 17.
And
we do have gotten
to Song of the Week.
We do have Song of the Week.
So we started this last week, and I guess we're just going to go back and forth. Tanner shared his Song of the Week last week. Mine this week is, Tanner shared a hymn, right? You shared a hymn, didn't you?
Yep.
I'll share some hymns too as well throughout this, but I'm going to start it off this time with a more contemporary song, and it's At the Cross. I think it's like At the Cross, and then in parentheses, Love Ran Red
Yeah.
is like
I
the
guess it
actual name of the
depends on
song.
your definition of contemporary, because I'm pretty sure that's like a 2000 song, and we're in 2024.
If it's not in the red hymn book that we have at the Sherman Church of Christ, it's contemporary.
Okay, that's what you consider
That's
contemporary.
what I consider
Some
contemporary.
some would say that it has to be within like the last 10 years. I'm not one of those people, but some would.
Okay.
But
Well,
yeah,
it's more contemporary than songs
Than-
in the hymnal.
than the song that I said last week. Yeah, that's a great song. At the Cross, Love Ran Red. We used to sing it at Sherman quite a bit.
So check out that one. Good sound lyrics. You can worship in spirit and truth. We talked
Yeah.
about that last week. If you missed it, that's important.
And that'll do it for this week. Feeling good?
Feels good to me, man. That's it.
All right.
Thanks for joining us, guys.
Yeah, we thank you for listening. We thank you for watching if you're on YouTube. And as always, go bear fruit, so prove to be one of Jesus' disciples.